Hey, welcome to the pilot episode of this series. This series is called The Archive. It deals with the hobby called fingerboarding, and I'm sure a lot of you know what a fingerboard is if you found this video, but some of you may not. So, to put it simply, there it is. This is what some people recognize as a fingerboard. This is a tech deck, a 26mm standard little tech deck, and you use it for tricks. Nowadays, if you go to Walmart, though, or Toys R Us or whatever, you might find something like this. This is a tech deck as well, but it's wider. This is a 32mm. Still use it for the same tricks. So, the segment we're starting with, and the series we'll be doing, are basically archive videos of the older days of fingerboarding, because some of you watching this series will remember these older brands that I'll be going through, but not everyone does. Not everyone that is fingerboarding nowadays remembers these older brands or were around for them. So we're going to start off with the company called Berlinwood, but you might nowadays recognize that name and be like, Brandon, that's not an older brand per se. Or you might be like, well, why would we talk about the entirety of it? We're not. What we're going to be focusing on are the old mold series. The old molds of Berlinwoods. These are the old mold series. These are some of the older ones from about 2003, I do believe, to 2009. It might have been 2001, I don't know for sure, I'll check that again. But I'm pretty sure it's 2003. I don't know offhand. I'm gonna edit that in with like a really drawn out like 2001 or 2003. But years and years ago, from like 2003 to 2009-ish, was the old mold series. That was their original form. They are, in my opinion, considered one of the hallmarks of the older fingerboard era. Now, I keep using the word era. What does that mean? Like, the context of this video. In the context of this video, there are certain, like, time periods when fingerboarding was one way, and then you go forward in time till you hit another era, and it becomes a different situation. I consider there to be an old era and the new era. The old era, in my opinion, is considered about 1999 till about 2008. 2008-ish, but the latest 2009. Because about 2009 is when Berlin was switched over to the new mold. A lot of companies switched over to new shapes, and black river trucks and wide trucks hit the scene about 2009. And that really changed things. One example of such change is the comparison of the old packaging. They used to come in poly bags with some paper advertising. Nothing too crazy, but basically it was some companies they worked with. There was also a warning slip in there to not really bend the boards overly much because you might break them, basically. Kind of just a warning. And this is probably one of the most iconic things people would recognize from back in the day if they were around when these were still being sold. And there's nothing too special to them. It's got some paper advertising and a plastic bag that it came in. But it was very iconic for the time, especially the front of that one specifically. So it was a very nice thing to see. This is an example of what is considered a regular Berlinwood. This is what people tend to have the most often. It was a 26mm with regular concave type board. These are some examples of some of those types of boards. They came in a couple different bottom types, and the top of the boards tend to be pretty simple as well. But the bottoms of the boards could get very exotic, like that example there. But it also just depended and varied. There were exotic woods used. There was just straight maple in some of them. There were some dyed bottoms. There was a good variety of boards that were available at the time. It really just depended on what you got in your order. You couldn't really pick back in the day what you got. I remember as a kid, I actually got a hold of Black River in their email asking for a specific type of dyed bottom. I didn't get what I asked for, but I did get a dyed one in the end, and I was very happy with it. So that's just kind of a thing that was very common back then. And this example right here, this last one, actually came from Timo himself. It was in his last stock of Berlinwoods he ever made. It's a bit of a long story, but it's a nice board to own, so I'm happy with that. This is an example of a Berlinwood regular, but it was a deep mold. So what does deep mean? Basically, as you can see from the side, it had a deeper concave. And it wasn't like super deep, but here's an example of some other ones. And again, there were some bird's eye bottoms. There was an example of there's a green one that has just like a natural dye to it. And again, with the deep concave, this was a bit more preferable for some people that enjoyed an easier board to flick. So that's an example of that. This is an example of a Berlinwood wide. The difference between the regular and the wide was that this is a 28mm model. It was about 2mm wider. Here's some examples of those boards as well. And there were some dyed bottoms with some bird's eye mixed in there. There's one of the maple boards I was talking about. I just noticed in that board as well, you could see like a recess where the trucks were. It's kind of like a low, like lane square, and that was very, very, very common for Berlinwood old molds. This is an example of a Berlinwood wide deep, because pretty much every version of the Berlinwood regular board had a deep version, and pretty much all of them came in these different types of variants. This is an example of like a deeper dark bottom. There's an example of a kind of more traditional maple bottom, and then this is an example of a purple bottom board. And again, it was very iconic to see the countersink type and whatnot. This is an example of a Berlinwood extra wide. These were 30 millimeters. When these were popular back in the day, this was actually the widest boards usually got. This is another example of such as well, with an exotic bottom. This is a Berlinwood cruiser, and these came in the same types of variants of bottom plies. These did not have a deep version though, weirdly enough. But here are examples of two other versions as well. This is a slightly different shape, but it was a maple, like a kind of a curly bottom, kind of like wavy. And here's another dyed bottom. It was kind of more of a regular, I don't think it's an exotic wood. Here's an example of what was really iconic for the old school shape. This is called a hammerhead. These were actually 31 millimeters, weirdly enough. And there was a couple different, types they'd use for bottom plies. It was mainly dyed, but you would eventually, maybe if you looked hard enough, find like maple variants as well. It tended to be more dyed bottom. They got really festive with the coloring. We'll call it that. But in the next clip, we move on to what are called the Berlinwood longboards. Of all the old mold series, the longboards are some of the hardest ones to find. This is an example of the deep model, because there was actually two different models. And here's some examples of that deep. They really commonly came in maple, but you would find dyed ones like this as well. It just depended on what you were looking for. And this is an example of another maple bottom as well. I got these ones from Timo himself in his last stock Berlinwood old molds. This is an example of the wide version of the longboard. That was a bird's eye bottom, and this is an example of just a natural maple bottom. I managed to find this one secondhand actually. It's pretty cool. This is an example of like one of the special variety Berlinwoods. That was an engraved board made by I think you pronounce it as Flocky. I can't remember exactly for sure. Super, super nice board though. Absolutely love that one. And there's the pile of Berlinwoods. They were a really common thing back in the day. People liked them a lot, and I was no exception to that. So they're like a hallmark in the old series. I like them. Overall, the Berlinwood Old Mold era is an era of decks that still stands the test of time. The boards were iconic. Timo Lieben, whom is the mastermind behind the decks, put love into every single board. Back in the heyday of these decks, they were the standard in a sense. Sure, a lot of it was kind of crowd hype, but to an extent, that was only just part of the truth. There was no denying the quality of these decks. There were countless unboxings and reviews. There were a ton of options with no matter what type you preferred, and every single board held its own beauty. If you happen to come across one of these, you shouldn't hesitate to consider picking it up. Thank you all, and see you in the next episode.